From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Donald Trump focuses on illegal migration with a visit to Aurora, Colorado.
Hell out of our country.
We'll look at the potential economic impact of tighter immigration policy with Professor Zeke Hernandez of Penn's Wharton School, author of The Truth About Immigration: Why Successful Societies Welcome Newcomers. Plus, Barack Obama focuses on black male voters as he hits the campaign trail for Kamala Harris. We'll focus on that key demographic with Quentin James, founder of the Collective PAC, this hour. And we begin this evening with what took place earlier this afternoon. Donald Trump speaking at a rally in Aurora, Colorado. Here's a piece of what he had to say in his immigration-focused speech.
We will put these vicious and bloodthirsty criminals in jail or kick them out of our country, and we will be very, very effective in doing it. It's going to happen very, very fast.
Joining me now is Bloomberg's Gregory Korte for more. So, Gregory, obviously this kind of messaging is not new from Donald Trump. He has floated ideas of mass deportation before, but taking it to Aurora, Colorado, a city which he has repeatedly targeted as evidence of the U.S.'s border and migration problem. How effective is this decision-making, considering Colorado's pretty safely not a swing state?
Yeah, it's interesting how the debate over the border has moved away from the border since the summer, when President Joe Biden enacted a number of actions to limit the number of people who can cross, these migrants and asylum seekers. And so now the debate has shifted to those migrants who are already here. In Springfield, Ohio, where we have Haitian immigrants, in we have Venezuelan immigrants in Aurora, Colorado. And those are the places where Trump has decided to spotlight. They are not swing states, however. And I think that's your point here. He is a little bit off the beaten path here, going to places to highlight the issues instead of the places, right? It's a very thematic campaign at this point, and he's going to the places that he thinks will best emphasize what he thinks are his strengths: the economy and immigration.
Well, he did say during his remarks that he would like to flip Colorado Republican, that he thinks he'd win Colorado because he'll make Colorado safe once again. But when we consider this expanded map he seems to be looking at, how much should we also consider that he's not just campaigning on behalf of himself, but other Republicans who actually may be in competitive races, even if the state isn't competitive on the presidential level? Yeah,
he's also said that he's going to flip New York State and he's going to flip California, where he'll be later. But those are places that there are some competitive House races. As a matter of fact, in New York, you can make the argument that control of the House of Representatives could very well go through New York City and its suburbs, Long Island, the Hudson Valley. These are 5 or 6 districts that Republicans won in the midterms of 2022 on the issue of crime, on the issue of immigration, on the issue of inflation. So it's a very rich issue environment for Trump there. But also, we know how close the House of Representatives is. The problem for Trump is he's got to win the presidency first before he can win. He can work with Congress. And so it's going to be a little bit of a balancing act. There are certainly some Trump allies who wish he would spend a little bit more time in Pennsylvania and Georgia and Wisconsin and Michigan. But Trump is seeing an expanded map here, and it's his time. That's one of the most valuable things that a campaign has, is the campaign contributions of money, but also the time of the candidate. And he alone controls where he goes. Well, and Kamala Harris is going places on her own. She has been in Arizona, also talking about the issue of immigration, which, of course, is a vulnerability of hers, as evidenced by Donald Trump's attacks, but also this difficult line for her to straddle as she tries not to alienate certain parts of her party either. Yeah, today she was in Arizona, and she talked about forming some sort of a bipartisan advisory board to advise her on policy. She says she's going to appoint a Republican to her cabinet. So part of this is a lot of outreach across the aisle on these issues. Part of her campaign has been to replay the Biden playbook in 2020. It's almost hard to remember now. But Joe Biden won in part by bringing over never Trump Republicans into the Democratic coalition. Harris is trying to reassemble that, but she has to do it in a slightly different way, and she has to do it a little bit more explicitly by saying how she's going to govern and reach out to Republicans, especially on the issue of immigration, and that's why she's in Arizona.
All right, Bloomberg's Gregory. Korte, thank you so much. Now, in the Middle East, Israel stepped up attacks on Hezbollah in Beirut overnight. And we learned today that the U.S. is announcing new sanctions on Iran's oil sector in response to the country's missile attack on Israel last week. Joining me now for more of the latest is Bloomberg's Courtney McBride, who covers national security for us. So, Courtney, obviously, we did hear from the U.S. initially after Iran launched this attack that was largely thwarted that they would be responding in some way. How much are these sanctions, though, also tied to the response the U.S. would like to see from Israel?
Well, certainly the U.S. has been pushing Israel, which it knows will respond militarily in some way, to really limit the scope of that response, to address military targets, but not to target either Iran's nuclear sites or its oil and gas sectors, because that could precipitate a larger retaliatory cycle. And so part of that U.S. sanctions response, we think, is aimed at staving off an Israeli military attack on those sites, providing an alternative way to limit Iran's ability to fund its proxy groups.
Well, so to that point, obviously, a lot of sanctions are already in place that are aimed at restraining Iran. So how exactly are these different? What are they trying to tighten up that are current loopholes, if you will, or ways in which Iran has been able to navigate these tight restrictions?
Well, part of what Iran has been able to do really relies on its customers, China being a key part of that market. And so the sanctions announced today rely on a Trump-era executive order that allows the U.S. to declare essentially an entire sector of the Iranian economy off limits because it allows the Iranian regime to fund its proxies. And so the entire petroleum and petrochemical sector really are subject to these restrictions in a way that they weren't previously.
As we consider Iran's oil capacity, there's also the question of the capacity of other Gulf states. As we have seen reporting that Iran is threatening to some of those other Arab countries, if there are attacks from Israel that are coming through your airspace, we could retaliate against you, too, that this would not just be an Iran versus Israel tit for tat. What else can you tell us about that as we still are awaiting Israel to calibrate its response to Iran here?
Certainly. I mean, we're seeing messaging from, not just from the U.S. to Israel and indirectly to Iran, but also from those Gulf states. Certainly the United Emirates and Saudi Arabia have concerns about their own oil industries. And so, everyone is trying to make sure that response, while Israel may be, they believe Israel may be justified in responding, that response doesn't precipitate a cycle that leads to damage not only to Iranian assets, but also the other Gulf states and potentially disrupts the oil markets, certainly ahead of a contentious U.S. election. Well,
and on that note, do we have any sense here of timing, Courtney, or are we all just going to be waiting and watching for some time?
I think we'll be watching very carefully in the coming days, but your guess is as good as mine, I think.
All right. Well, your guess is pretty good. Bloomberg's Courtney McBride, thank you so much, as always, for your reporting. Now to some late day news from Boeing. After the market closing bell, the company announced plans to cut its workforce by about 10%. This move comes as it faces a drawn out strike by workers and a worsening cash crunch. The job reductions will include executives, managers, and employees. It also pre-announced earnings, saying it expects to report third quarter revenue of $17.8 billion and a loss per share of $9.97, which is short of estimates. It added that its first deliveries of the 777X are now expected in 2026. This has been a tough week for Boeing, who saw the latest strike talks collapse, and S&P Global Ratings said Boeing was at risk of a credit downgrade to junk. Now coming up, we'll turn back to the issue of immigration and its economic impact. We'll speak with UPenn Wharton School Associate Professor Zeke Hernandez next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
The first bill we offered within hours of taking the oath was a bill to fix the immigration system, including creating a comprehensive, earned pathway to citizenship for hardworking people. And it was not taken up. And now we look at a situation where people are suffering. Real leadership is about solving problems on behalf of the people. And I'm so sorry for what you've been through. I'm so sorry for what you've been through.
Vice President Kamala Harris last night at the town hall in Las Vegas, hosted by Univision. For more on the crucial issue of immigration and how it impacts our economy specifically, joining me now here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Zeke Hernandez, professor at the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School and author of The Truth About Immigration: Why Successful Societies Welcome Newcomers. So, Zeke, welcome to you. Your book obviously takes a look at the role immigration has played in shaping the U.S. economy. What has that role been to this point? And how do you make a differentiation between those who immigrated to this country through legal means with a system that we were just hearing the vice president talking about may need reform versus the impact of people who have come here illegally?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. The short answer is that every person contributes 5 important things to the economy. They bring innovation, they bring investment, they bring consumption, they bring their talent, and they bring taxes. And those are the 5 inputs that any economy needs to create good jobs and grow. Immigrants bring all those same 5 inputs because they're people. The difference is that immigrants not only bring more of those things, but because they have different backgrounds, tastes and preferences, different ideas, they bring a greater variety of all those things. And the United States has forever benefited significantly from all of those things because of the businesses immigrants start, because of the consumption they bring, because of the jobs they create. Those 5 things that I mentioned make immigrants net job creators. Now, you asked me about immigrants who are here with legal authorization versus not. The reality is that regardless of how immigrants come in, whether legally or not, whether through humanitarian or other reasons, every single one of them provides those 5 things. Of course, we would want more orderly and legal channels because when people come here without authorization, they're limited in the amount of those 5 things that they can contribute. But we certainly need those people. We just need a more orderly system to bring them in.
Well, we just heard from Vice President Harris on this, Zeke. What we have heard from Donald Trump is suggestions that people coming into this country are stealing jobs, specifically jobs of people of color like Black and Hispanic workers. He has also advocated for mass deportations of people in this country who have not come in through legal means. What would actually happen to the U.S. economy if we were to see millions of people deported? What is the immediate impact on labor supply and therefore on growth overall?
Yeah, you know, we actually don't have to speculate what the impact will be because this has happened before in both past and recent history. And there's been really good studies that show that it's always resulted in a disaster for American workers and the American economy. For example, there are studies showing that deportation during the Obama era through the Secure Communities program actually destroyed jobs for Native workers, right? For about every million people deported, about 88,000 American Native-born people lost jobs. And also we have historical precedents from the 1920s and 30s during the Great Depression when more than half of the Mexican-American population was forcibly deported, and that also resulted in job losses for Native workers and worse jobs for Native workers. And it also resulted in other bad things for us. For example, Native-born scientists and inventors patented less because they weren't as exposed to the new ideas and creativity that their immigrant colleagues provided. Also, the number of taxpayers went down, consumption went down in the economy. So basically, it's a reversal of those 5 inputs that I mentioned. It would really be a disaster for us.
Well, Zeke, this is something I spoke about today alongside my colleague Joe Matthew on the early edition of Balance of Power. We talked to Scott Bessent. He's CEO of Key Square Capital. He's also become an economic advisor to Donald Trump. And when we asked him about these ideas of mass deportation and the potential economic impact, this was his response to us. So take a listen, and I'll have you respond.
In this cycle, when we had the massive inflation, we get, whether it's 11 million new arrivals, or as President Trump thinks, 21 million new arrivals, it does push down wages on the bottom quintile, which I think is abominable. These are working people, Americans, who are seeing their wages get pushed down.
So, Zeke, let's talk about wages. Is that true?
No, it's not. It's not. This is a common misconception. It's actually based on some studies from the 90s and early 2000s that purported to show that immigrants negatively affect the wages of native-born high school dropouts. Those studies have actually been debunked and superseded by better evidence. The most recent study, which actually came out just a few months ago, shows that in just the last 25 years, the arrival of immigrants has actually created jobs for native workers, both high skilled and unskilled, and also has actually boosted the wages of unskilled workers by about 2 to 3%. So not a massive boost, but a small boost. So it's exactly the opposite of what we just heard. And that misconception is often commonly accepted because people only think of the arrival of immigrants as an increase in the number of workers, which is true. But don't forget that the arrival of immigrants is also an increase in the number of consumers in the economy. It's an increase in the number of people who might start businesses. It's an increase in the number of people who might bring new ideas and innovations. All of those things make the economic pie not just bigger, but more diversified, and that benefits native-born workers because it creates more jobs and more different types of jobs for them. That's the academic consensus, and it's quite clear really in the last 15 years or so.
Well, Zeke, as you talk about the idea that there are more people to contribute to the labor supply, essentially, I was struck by analysis from the Economic Policy Institute that looked at basically what would have been the growth in the prime age workforce over the last quarter century without immigration. There would have been no growth. Can you just speak about the demographic challenge the United States is facing and how immigration could be a solution, or at least a key part in making sure that those demographics are less challenging?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's no subtle way to put it. It is the only solution because our birth rates have gone below replacement, and it seems like they're going to permanently stay below replacement. Governments have not proven able to increase birth rates through policy. Our population, as we know, is aging very rapidly. We have a lot of people moving into retirement. And so without immigration, the working age population would decline a lot. One recent estimate is that by about 2050, that is, if we stop all immigration, there would be 20 million fewer working age people in our economy. That means 20 million fewer workers, taxpayers, innovators. What would happen to Social Security? What would happen to Medicare? And a lot of jobs would be lost for those very same people in the bottom quintile that this person that you just quoted mentioned. And so really the only solution we have is to bring more people in from other countries or to increase productivity through automation and robotics like Japan has tried to do. But even Japan has learned that that's not enough. And so Japan is desperately trying to implement a migrant worker program. We don't want to go there.
Zeke, we just have a minute left, but if there were one reform to help make the U.S. immigration system better and better for the economy, what is it? What would you advise?
Look, there's research that's very clear on this by many people showing that the only solution to irregular immigration is to make more legal pathways available. We haven't upgraded our immigration system since 1990. So for 35 years, our economy has grown and diversified, but we're not allowing enough people in. And that's the main cause of all the border problems that are so much in the news and in politics. So we just have to increase the number of visas allowed. We have to also have a greater diversity of entry paths and balance out and have a lot more economic paths because most of the paths right now are family reunification. If we do those things, we'll have a healthy system that will allow us to bring in a lot more of those 5 economic inputs that I mentioned at the beginning.
All right, Zeke, thank you so much for joining me. Insightful stuff from Zeke Hernandez, Associate Professor at the Wharton School. And coming up, as the damage totals rise following Hurricanes Milton and Helene, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall will be here with a look at the state of funding for FEMA. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. President Biden announced today he will travel to Florida over the weekend to survey the devastation left behind from Hurricane Milton. It comes as damage estimates from the storm start to pour in. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has been tracking the numbers. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kaylee. President Biden says the damage from Hurricane Milton alone could cost about $50 billion, and it comes as the federal government is rapidly spending its disaster relief budget. FEMA says it's used nearly $9 billion of the $20 billion it has allocated for fiscal year 2025, which only just started as the agency works to fill a backlog of requests from earlier this year. FEMA is now requesting additional funding, and it's not alone. The Small Business Administration has become critical in the federal response. The SBA provides low-interest loans to homeowners and businesses, in some cases up to $2 million to rebuild after disasters. President Biden is urging Congress to come back into session to pass emergency funds for these agencies.
I think in terms of the SBA, it's pretty right at the edge right now. And I think the Congress should be coming back and moving on the emergency needs immediately. And they're going to have to come back after the election as well, because this is going to be a long haul for total rebuilding. It's going to take several $1 billion. It's not going to be a matter of just a little bit.
Now, Congress is out of session until November 12th. House Speaker Mike Johnson has said it's unlikely lawmakers will come back early since there's still significant money in the fund and further damage estimates could take time. Experts say part of the issue is that FEMA is playing catch up. The bulk of this money that was already spent this fiscal year was to reimburse states waiting on the assistance for months prior. You, Kaylee, actually had the chance to speak with former FEMA administrator who says that this cycle needs to stop.
You know, I went through it when I was FEMA administrator in 2017 to 19. I had to ask Congress 3 times for more funding into the disaster relief fund. And eventually it was approved. But how do we get out of this cycle? And right now, I believe it's not just the funding, but how do we get out of this response cycle? And where do we start to incentivize communities to do the right things, such as proper land use planning, implementing the stronger building codes that the ICC recommends?
Now, of course, we're coming up on the election, and the economy is repeatedly a top issue for Americans, according to our Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling. And the hurricane could play a factor here. Initial jobless claims spiked last week, partly due to disruptions from Hurricane Helene. And Kaylee, we could see supply chain issues right up to November as ports along the coast in Florida, for example, remain closed.
And Tyler, quickly, as we consider the supply of goods, I also wonder about the transit of ballots in the aftermath of these storms with the election coming up, as you just mentioned.
Right, exactly. Some key states that have already been impacted, such as North Carolina and Florida, are already starting to take steps to ensure that people that might be displaced in their homes still have access to mail-in ballots. And just quickly, Florida, for example, is already starting to reevaluate polling sites to make sure that they're in the clear and that voters can access them.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, great reporting. Thank you so much. Now coming up, we'll take a look at Kamala Harris's appeal to black male voters with Quentin James. He is founder and president of the Collective PAC. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think it's very important to not operate from the assumption that black men are in anybody's pocket. Black men are like any other voting group. You got to earn their vote. So I'm working to earn the vote, not assuming I'm going to have it because I am black.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris last month speaking to the National Association of Black Journalists. And in trying to aid her effort to earn the vote of black men, former President Barack Obama is stepping in. He spoke directly to them in a campaign stop in Pittsburgh yesterday.
Part of it makes me think, I'm speaking to men directly, part of it makes me think that, well, you just aren't feeling the idea of having a woman as president. And you're coming up with other alternatives and other reasons for it.
Joining me now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Quentin James. He is founder and president of the Collective PAC, which focuses on getting more African-American representation into those elected to office and turning voters of color out to vote. So thank you very much for being with me in studio here in Washington. If we could just take a real assessment, I would love to hear from you, Quentin, on how Kamala Harris actually is faring with black men, because we have seen A lot of morning newsletters, shall we say, focusing on this subject. We're hearing from the Trump campaign about his efforts to court this group. Obviously, it's not a monolith, but what's your read?
Listen, I think the vice president is out there working to earn the votes of black men like she is any other demographic group. And so I think we got to give her credit for that. But the reality is she's only been campaigning in the real way as a nominee for only 2.5 months now. And so a lot of black men still don't know her yet. They still have a lot of questions. I kind of call it curiosity. And so, you know, I think we got to give black men the space to ask those questions, to seek information. But overall, I think she's doing pretty good in terms of earning the black men's vote.
What are the questions you're hearing them ask? What are the issues that ultimately are the decision makers for whether the vote is earned or lost? The
big issue right now is the economy. You know, they heard a lot around tax cuts for people under Donald Trump. They felt that the economy was better under Donald Trump. But I think what we heard yesterday from President Obama was maybe one of the reasons that is because there was 75 straight months of job growth under the last administration before Donald Trump. So maybe he inherited some of that. Even with the tax cuts, you know, he cut taxes for, billionaires and corporations, not for the average worker. And so a lot of this is kind of correcting the record. And we need time to do that, but also time to explain what the vice president wants to do, how she wants to bring costs down, how she wants to raise wages, how she wants to build wealth. And so I think the Biden-Harris administration has been doing a good job of that. But what does that mean for the future? And that's kind of the question that people are asking right now.
Well, and I wonder, as we consider their questioning and their decision here, do you see this as more of a decision to either vote for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, or a decision whether to vote at all? Is this as much a turnout question? Mm-hmm. Or is this a turnout question, I guess is the proper way of phrasing it?
Listen, it is both. I mean, what we have seen since 2012, every 4 years, 1 to 2 point difference in terms of black men supporting the Republican nominee. We know Donald Trump performed better than the previous kind of candidates on the Republican side. And so we got to understand there is a little bit of slippage happening.
Why do you think that is?
I think the Republicans and Donald Trump have done a good job of engaging black men, of going after the black vote. One of my criticisms of the Democrats, and I'm a Democrat and proud of it, is that we haven't spent enough money and done enough work to engage black men on these questions around the economy, on things beyond kind of policing and criminal justice. Those things are important as well. But how do we actually again raise wages, improve work, and build wealth for black men? Those are big concerns. And so there have been efforts from the right to, sometimes confuse, but sometimes persuade black men. And so we got to acknowledge that and recognize that and go out there and work hard and earn their vote.
Well, and get them to turn out, to go back to the question I was asking before. How do you galvanize that desire to go to the polls? What ignites that?
Well, listen, what we know is that voters who are invested in are the ones who show up and vote. And so you got to spend money. You got to knock on doors. You got to make those phone calls. But you got to meet them where they are. So we're talking about, barbecues and talking about barbershops. You got to go where black men are convening and have these conversations. We really haven't seen that type of campaign work since 2016. Remember, 2020 was a pandemic. So much of the campaigning was done on TV or on radio or on digital. And those things are important. I'm not saying don't do those, but you got to go out there and kind of have this kind of hand-to-hand kind of conversation with folks and bring them into the process.
What about black women? How is the approach needed there different? How are the support levels you're seeing different? The desire to turn out and vote different?
I think we're going to see a historic number of black women show up to vote because we have a black woman running for president. We saw that the first night she kind of announced, I think it was over 40,000 black women, got on that first Zoom call to raise money for her. And so that energy is going to be exciting to watch. And there's not a lot of work, in my opinion, that has to, kind of go to motivate that vote even more. Obviously, you got to do the work of kind of, your basic kind of campaign work. But I think black women will be there. I think what we haven't really seen is this kind of energy and organizing for black men. And that's what I'm, kind of concerned about going into the last few weeks.
As you raise the historic nature of her candidacy, that she would be not just a woman, but a black woman elected president of the United States, she has frankly not been leading into that at all, one could argue. She is not really making this about her identity. Is that a mistake? Should she be doing more of that? Well,
listen, I think, first of all, we all want the most qualified candidate to be president. I think she is, in our opinion, in my opinion, the most qualified candidate. And so that's important to kind of, lean on who you are, lean on your accomplishments and your resume. But yes, for a lot of black voters, it does matter who she is, her background. That is going to be a motivating factor, but it's not the most important. Again, these questions on the economy, how she's going to improve, the issues around inflation right now, those things are of what's most concerning for voters. But it's exciting to have the opportunity to kind of break that glass ceiling of putting a black woman in the White House. It will be historic.
And if that happens, knowing your wider effort here is just to get more black representation into all levels of public office, what do you think that would unlock? Knowing we already, of course, have seen the historic presidency of Barack Obama, that is one glass ceiling, I guess you could consider shattered. But would this mean something else?
It does. We have a saying at the Collective PAC that if you want to change the laws, you must change the lawmakers. And so having, again, the first woman, having a black woman in the White House, a graduate of a HBCU, that stuff really matters in terms of thinking about who is prioritized in policy conversations. The federal government has to really be there for all Americans. And one could argue that it hasn't been there for many different groups of Americans historically. And so I think she could, and she will, hopefully when she wins, be a historic candidate and she be president to, bring the people forward. Her kind of campaign slogan was Kamala Harris for the people. And so that will be amazing. But it also, I think, shows people that you could, run for president one day. Little black girls, little, boys as well. But anybody can kind of, achieve these historic accomplishments by seeking the highest office in the land. I think it's incredible.
All right, we're going to leave it on that note. Quentin, thanks very much
for
being here. Quentin James is founder and president of the Collective PAC. Now coming up, Donald Trump focuses on immigration in Aurora, Colorado, as he widens his campaign map beyond just the swing states. Our signature panel weighs in next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I love this state. This state has to flip Republican. It has to. Colorado is going to vote for me because I am going to make Colorado safe again. We're going to make you safe. We're going to do it fast.
That was Donald Trump campaigning in Aurora, Colorado earlier this afternoon, a city which has become a major target of his focus on illegal migration. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is our signature panel. Closing us out this week, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital Partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, Political Science Professor at Iona University and Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. I don't know if either of you actually believe he stands a chance of flipping Colorado Republican in this cycle, but this notion, Rick, that he would win Colorado potentially because he could make Colorado safer from what he is alleging is the overrunning of towns like Aurora with migrant gangs. Does this message expand beyond his base, those voters willing to cast their ballot for him?
Well, we do know that some of his immigration policies are very popular. Almost 60% in some polls say they're for this kind of mass deportation. So we forget that he's pulling at the heartstrings of people who feel frustrated that nothing has been able to happen in the Biden administration related to sort of controlling and managing immigration. So yes, I mean, this is a winning issue for Donald Trump, and he owns this issue. I mean, more so than any other, and he revels in talking about it. When he talks about the economy, he barely can get his words out. But when he talks about immigration, he stays on message. And of course, today was simply going to a place that he could make up a story that would demonstrate an evil that really doesn't exist, but does it for his supporters. And so it's very much a task to get his supporters excited and turning out more than appealing to a broader base.
Well, and Jeannie, he would argue that really what he's saying here is very simple. He's going to get these people out. Is that a messaging that is effective against more policy wonk, if you will, ideas of immigration reform that Kamala Harris is putting forward?
You know, I think Axios described it beautifully today. It's his apocalyptic tour, and that is really what we're going to see for the next 3 weeks before this campaign ends. And, you know, I thought it was really effective last night when former President Obama asked, when did this become okay, in the context of his fabrications and lies, quite frankly, about hurricane relief. And the same thing applies to what he's doing out in Aurora. Aurora's crime has been down for 2 years in a row. The mayor, the governor, said none of what he is saying is true. Same thing that happened in Springfield. I mean, I'm losing track, Kayleigh, of the number of local and state officials, Republican and Democrat, who have to keep fact-checking Donald Trump in terms of what he is saying. And so to Barack Obama's point, when did this become okay? Well, apparently for Donald Trump, it's okay because, to Rick's point, and Rick is right, he's doing this because he thinks it will be effective to drum up his base as he moves into a really competitive election. And no, he has no chance of winning Colorado.
Well, so to pick up on that point, Rick, if he doesn't stand a chance of winning the state and we're 3.5 weeks out from the election, why spend time there? Or these other states we understand he's going to be spending time, including wanting to hold a rally in Madison Square Garden in New York this month?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think Madison Square Garden, 9 days from the election, is a effort to try and build momentum. And I actually think it's a pretty smart idea. You know, he can get a great boisterous crowd. One of his greatest events online was when he walked into Madison Square Garden during a wrestling match, and the thumping music, and the crowd went crazy, and it went viral. That's what he's trying to replicate there. So I get that. Why do you go to Colorado? Well, as a backdrop to showcasing his immigration plans. And the campaign has been very clear. They're not afraid to do that because they know that we're going to take him, you know, and spread that message into states like North Carolina and Arizona and Georgia and Nevada and the Blue Wall. So the reality is, you know, the media is doing the work for Donald Trump that he's not doing, which is going actually to these swing states and making the case there. Look, at the end of the day, I'm not sure the old-style politics of only campaigning in the targeted areas is going to last the test of time. Obviously, if Donald Trump wins, nobody's ever going to go back to that model. I mean, it's going to be something new, but it may be unique to him. But I still think a day not spent in a swing state is a day lost to the opposition.
Well, there you go. The consideration, though, I guess, Jeannie, that we should factor in here is that while the swing states will decide the presidential election, there's all kinds of elections happening up and down the ballot, including in some of these states like New York, where the balance of the House of Representatives could ultimately decide it. Do you think that's a factor here? It's not about Trump, but about other Republicans who need him?
You know, knowing Donald Trump the way we do, I have to say my guess is it's all about Donald Trump. You know, you only have some certain resources in a campaign. You have time, you have money. And he doesn't have a lot of time and he doesn't have a lot of money in comparison to Kamala Harris. And so he is doing these big events, Madison Square Garden, as Rick talked about, because he can get free earned media out of it. And he's also incentivized then to say increasingly outrageous things to ensure his coverage. I mean, I was fascinated to listen to Governor Polis from Colorado say he hesitates to even talk about this because it's exactly what Donald Trump wants us to do, is talk about what he is doing that seems so incredibly unusual and the sort of off-the-wall things he is saying. But of course, he's the main candidate on the Republican side, so you've got to follow him and report on what he is saying. But I think to go back to Barack Obama, when did any of this become okay is the question to ask.
Well, and if it's this idea, Rick, of he says something outlandish, therefore we all talk about it, is there a point in an election cycle, especially this close to Election Day, where bad publicity can actually just be bad publicity?
Yeah, there could be a tipping point to this. I mean, we really haven't experienced it yet. He campaigned this way in 2016. He campaigned again this way in 2020. If anything, it's just gotten more and more intense. You know, he's flooding the zone with disinformation. I mean, we just came off of a couple of days of fighting back stories that were created by he and his campaign on, you know, FEMA and the disaster recovery. Now we're right back into immigration. I think it's one of these things where he has a strategy, and he's executing that strategy. And that strategy is flood the zone with as much disinformation so that nobody really knows what's true or not, which means everything he says is true, at least to some people. And we know that half the country believes they get their news from Donald Trump, that he is the truth teller. And so it's naive on our part to think this stuff doesn't stick. It does.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino will be sticking with me because coming up, Kamala Harris is making an appeal to black male voters with the help of former President Barack Obama. We'll have more on that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think the vice president is out there working to earn the votes of black men like she is any other demographic group. And so I think we got to give her credit for that. But the reality is she's only been campaigning in the real way as a nominee for only 2.5 months now. And so a lot of black men still don't know her yet. They still have a lot of questions.
That was Quentin James, founder and president of the Collective PAC, earlier this hour. Back with me here on Balance of Power, our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. So, Jeannie, obviously there has been a lot of noise made in recent weeks about Kamala Harris and courting black men, which Donald Trump is doing as well. And this isn't even just limited to black men, but men in general, as there is a massive gender gap in this election. How can she close that realistically, bring more people on side in the next 3.5 weeks?
It's going to be tough. I mean, her best options here are to try to narrow this gap. There's no way she closes it completely because, as you mentioned, we are seeing a gender divide. We've always had a gender divide since the early 80s, but one that is much more stark than usual, particularly pronounced amongst young people. So there's a big division between young women and young men, with young women going much more for Kamala Harris and young men of all races and colors and religions for Donald Trump. And so she's got to get people like Barack Obama out there to try to close it. I think, you know, nobody is better at speaking to Democrats than Barack Obama. He's a great communicator. The problem is you do have a subset of people who feel that he is talking down to them, and his remarks, particularly to black men yesterday, were over the top. And so that has become a real lightning rod in the last 24 hours.
Well, you mentioned him, Jeannie, so let's hear a little bit of the former President Barack Obama campaigning for Kamala Harris in Pittsburgh last night.
Raising kids is hard. And she wants to make it easier to afford stuff like a crib or a car seat or diapers. I remember buying diapers. I remember the first time I went in the store right after Malia was born. I was like, what? That's how much diapers cost? I remember changing diapers. You think Donald Trump ever changed a diaper?
That part, obviously not what we heard from former President Obama when it comes to black men in particular, Rick. But when Jeannie was suggesting that Obama can be an effective messenger for Harris, is he her best chance on bringing more of these black men along with her?
Not if that's the message. Look, I think part of what you were describing was some of his comments related to directly trying to motivate black men to support Kamala Harris. And he was trying to make the case that they got to get over the fact that she's a woman.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of focus groups in the course of this election, and a lot of them with young white and black men, since that has been a target group since the early summer. And the reality is it's an economic message. These young men had more money in their pocket during the Trump presidency than they've had during the Biden presidency. Unless you are addressing their personal economic situation, you are talking past them. And the idea that somehow you got to put the sort of number on them that says, oh, you're just afraid to vote for a woman, I think echoes what Jeannie was saying, which is, tone deaf. That is not the hesitation in the young black male community, especially with the upper ages of the 18 to 29-year-olds. And so if he does not address that, then I suspect he will whistle past the graveyard on the way to a loss in this election.
All right. Well, Jeannie, as we covered that demographic, there also is the question of how Harris is faring with Hispanic voters specifically. She obviously did a town hall on Univision last night. She's in Arizona talking about immigration. What is the winning message for her that will win Hispanic voters?
I think it's the same one that Rick was just talking about. I go back to the Gallup poll, which I think has the, in the starkest terms, 9 out of 10 Americans, regardless of race, gender, anything else, say it is all about the economy. So she needs to tell people she knows what they're feeling in terms of economic pain, and she is prepared to address it. And by the way, in a way differently than Joe Biden, because of course his path forward has not been one that's attractive to people. So she's got to talk about that.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature political panel, thank you so much. And a special programming note, on Tuesday at noon Eastern Time, Bloomberg's editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite will be interviewing Donald Trump live at the Economic Club of Chicago, exactly 3 weeks before the election. So we'll have full coverage of that, special coverage, in fact, here on Bloomberg TV and radio beginning Tuesday. In the meantime, we'll head out for the weekend, but we'll see you back here next week. Thanks for joining Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.